Thank you so much for being here. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Audsley, and I'm the Writing Across Media Facilitator at Vermont Studio Center. This reading pairs writers together, inviting them to read and discuss their work and the craft of writing. I'm so happy to have both Cedel and Angela here tonight with us. Cedel was my mentor at Warren Wilson MFA Program for Writers, and he is also Angela's mentor. So it is particularly special to be able to host these two writers together tonight. They both have new books out. So happy and pleased to be hearing from both of their books this evening. And I'm going to introduce them by reading their short bios, and Angela will read first, Cedel will read second, and then they are invited to ask each other questions, be in conversation, and also we'll be opening it up to all of you to ask questions and engage with our two readers tonight. Our first reader tonight is Angela Narciso Torres, and she is the author of What Happens Is Neither, Four-Way Books 2021, Blood Orange, winner of the 2013 Willow Books Literature Award for Poetry, and the chapbook To the Bone, Sundress Publications 2020. Recent work appears or is forthcoming in Poetry, Missouri Review, Quarterly West, Portland Review, and Poetry Northwest. A graduate of Warren Wilson MFA Program for Writers and Harvard Graduate School of Education, Angela has received fellowships from Bread Loaf Writers Conference, Illinois Art Council, and Ragdale Foundation. She received first prize in the Yates Poetry Prize, W.B. Yeats Society of New York, and New York City Magazine named her one of Chicago's Lit 50 who really books in Chicago. Born in Brooklyn and raised in Manila, she currently resides in San Diego. She serves as a senior and reviews editor for Rhino Poetry. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Angela. Our second reader tonight is my former MFA mentor and wielder of the red pen. Cedel Young practices medicine full-time and teaches in the Warren Wilson College MFA Program for Writers. He is the author of a novel and stories, The Affliction, Four-Way Books 2018, and 5 collections of poetry, the most recent being Prometeo from Four-Way Books 2021. He is a recipient of fellowships from the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, the National Endowment for the Arts, the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation. He is the 2017-2018 recipient of the Haynes Award from the Fellowship of Southern Writers. Thank you so much for being here, Cedel. At this time, I'm going to invite Angela to read for us.
Thank you so much, Sarah. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the Vermont Studio Center for having me, for having us, for pairing Cedel, my former mentor as well, with me tonight. And thank you, Sarah, for your impeccable organizational skills getting this together. Everything was so smooth and beautifully done. I'd like to thank Cedel for making time in his busy schedule to read with me tonight. And I want to thank each of you out there in the ether for making time to join us on a Friday night. I'll start with 3 poems from the new book and then move on to a couple of newer poems. This book, What Happens Is Neither, was published by Four-Way Books in February of this year, but it was accepted really barely months after I lost my parents to my mom to Alzheimer's and my father about a week later to cancer. So at its core, this book is a book about loss. It's both an homage and an elegy to my parents, but it's also a book about reinventing and redefining the self after loss. As with any loss, we're forced to look back, to remember, to bear witness, to record. And for my first poem, I'd like to read A Remembrance of My Mother, who, though she was a competent physician and a wonderful cook and a pianist and full of life, she also battled depression and anxiety all her life. And though we as children inherit our parents' attributes, their personalities, their physical characteristics, sometimes we inherit their grief and trauma as well. And what do we do with that when that's the only reality we know? Just for context, that's my mother there above my typewriter, giving her famous side eye. Her name was Carmen. And this is Stone Fruit. Her sadness is coarse and thick as a horsehair coat. As a child, I tried it on. Its heavy folds engulfed me. I learned to balance the weight on my head the way fruit sellers carried baskets of mangoes on their crowns. Mornings, it cloyed to my throat like the hairy pits of droops. My eyes teared. I tried to spit. It insisted, impeded my breathing. I swallowed the bitter stone, washed it down like the whale who gulped a grown man and kept him in darkness for days. As a child, I learned this from an aunt. If you swallow a seed, a tree will grow in your stomach. I nurture her sadness like a sapling. Decades of summers pass. The tree fruits. Lay your hand on my chest. Feel the heft of sour sweet droops my mother's tears have fed. So as I mentioned, this book is also a meditation on how we redefine ourselves after loss, especially a loss as huge as that of a parent. And so this book has a number of self-portraits in it, and this is one of them. Self-portrait as water. Why does the body feel more beautiful underwater? Is what goes through me when I break the glass surface. Levels rising as I plumb the tub's white womb, this second skin thinner, slicker, gleaming wet as a lacquered bowl. Because the simplest of molecules, 2 H's, 1 O, love to love each other, cling to what they touch. How this universal solvent swallows every hill, fills the hollows of my surrender. Most forgiving of substances, I resolve to live like you, to fill and be filled, to take the shape of my vessel, dispensing heat, displacing matter, lighter than air. So my dad, he took care of my mother until her death, which is what he really wanted. He didn't want to go before her. Then he passed 11 days later, as much from his own battle with cancer as from a broken heart, we all think. So when she was well into her late stages of dementia, my dad found that the best way to communicate with my mother was by playing his violin. And it's one of the few things of his that I still keep. And it's back there, balanced precariously on my dictionary. And I keep it close by to where I write because it's a talisman and a reminder of how music and how poetry really can transcend language, especially when our usual words fail. So I'm going to read the title poem from the book, What Happens Is Neither. And the title just flows into the first line. What happens is neither the end nor the beginning, yet we're wired to look for signs. Consider the peonies. One makes a perfect bud after months of nothing. Another's leaves are ringed with black rot. How can I not think end? How can I not say beginning? Leaves fall when days shorten because a tree must reduce to its tough parts, twig, branch, bark. My mother sweeps away the daylight. She nods off while chewing a spoonful of fish and rice, her head a peony gone to seed. Father calls to say she doesn't recognize him. Turning to him, she cried out, certain a stranger was in her bed. He played his violin till she slept, a leaf in late fall curling into itself. In autumn, chlorophyll disappears, canceling green from leaves, so yellow and magenta can blaze. In my mirror, I see her, the smile that favors a cheek, eyes slanting in the shape of small fish we eat for breakfast. Trees know best the now of things. What goes on has been going on for centuries. Washing dishes, I rest a foot on my standing leg. A fork clangs on the tile. I rinse a cracked cup. I try not to think of endings. I'm going to move on to a couple of newer poems that are not in the book. This next one I wrote, I guess, in the past year. So I'm not one of those poets who wrote a ton during the pandemic. A lot of people are saying, oh, I'm writing so much. I mean, I wish I were, but it's been really hard for me to write in the midst of this pandemic. So I think this is as close as I've come to writing a pandemic poem. It's still a grief poem. Obviously, I'm still mourning one of the greatest losses I think anyone would ever experience, the loss of their parents. But I feel that at this time, every personal grief becomes a collective grief. And so, yeah, I guess I'll call this my pandemic poem. It's a sonnet, and I found that writing about these big feelings benefit from choosing a container for them. I didn't know this when I started writing, but it ended up in the sonnet form. This grief, a stone baked into parched earth. This grief, a stone baked into parched earth. It rains for days, the clay will not relent. This grief, like so many griefs, yet like no other, as dusk purples the sky with one palette, then paints the hills and plains another. We grow old, with aches in our bones, faces mapping where we smiled or scowled too much. This was the year I did both or neither. And time was water filling a stranded boat. The dog's leg will heal or not. The rose encumbered with slugs bloom or not bloom. The cat hiss or purr. Night comes down with her tattered skirt. The sun will wake, his face a knot or star. Things are always and never what they are. And one more new poem. This one is a semi-cento. And by that, I mean it alternates with original lines with lines that I borrowed from a book of prose, really. The book is Playing and Reality by D.W. Winnicott. He was a British psychoanalyst and pediatrician. And in my other life, when I was still studying to be a counseling psychologist, he was my favorite because, well, I have a picture of him here somewhere. Well, anyway, I don't know where I put the picture, but oh, here. He looks really kind. And when I was panicking with my final papers, my friend said, just look at his face. Isn't that a kind face? And his whole theory was that the true self can only be realized if we allow ourselves to play. And so he studied this in children, that children at play are closest to their truest and most creative selves. And I think that's true of poetry. It's a form of play. He also coined the term "the good enough mother," and I love that. I love that idea that to be a good mother, you only have to be a good enough mother. You don't have to be a perfect mother, and that it actually benefits your child when you mess up every now and then because it teaches them how to adapt to an imperfect world. So, in reading this poem, I'll raise two fingers whenever I'm quoting from Winnicott, and that will be every other line. The good enough mother. Lying beside my mother, I learned stillness. The child is alone only in the presence of someone. She made me keep vigil when father worked late. Fear of breakdown is the fear of a breakdown that has already been experienced. On starched sheets, I waited for her madcap heart to slow, her forehead to uncrease. Tell me what you fear, and I will tell you what has happened to you. I tried not to sneeze, got scolded for making the bed creak. The normal child, if she has confidence in mother and father, pulls out all the stops. I pretended we were playing hide and seek. It is a joy to be hidden and disaster not to be found. I learned the ways of pebbles, saffron-robed priests, rice fields. The alternative to being is reacting. Reacting interrupts being and annihilates. I was immovable, unfazed by wind or rain. And now for my last poem, I will go back to the book. And this last poem is an homage to Yeats as much as it is an homage to my teacher, Cedale Young, who shares a love of Yeats's poetry with me. I mean, I learned this when I became a student, but I've always been a lover of Yeats, and that even deepened more when we read and studied Yeats' poems together. The poem is A Golden Shovel, which, as you know, is a poem that borrows a line from another poem and uses each of the words in that line as end words for each of the lines. And the line is borrowed from the Yeats poem, The Circus Animal's Desertion, which most of you have heard of. And the line is, the foul rag and bone shop of the heart. Yeats wrote this towards the end of his life when he was an old man, but this, in contrast, is a poem about young motherhood. The foul rag and bone shop of the heart. I'm not just talking about the sleepless days and nights, the nonstop nursing, the foul smelling diapers. I'm talking of how my body reeked, a soaked rag of curdled milk, drool, and leaky nappies. And how I'd wake already beat beyond blood, bone, and breath, the baby still at my breast. But when I pushed past a shop window the other day, I turned to do a double take, a glimmer of a woman I once knew. No, it wasn't just the wind-tossed hair, the morning weary face, but oh, the heart, the heart. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. Cedale, you're up.
I am up. Angela, those were beautiful, beautiful poems. And I'm thrilled to be reading with Angela. And I'm happy that Sarah invited me. And I'm very glad that all of you are taking some time on a Friday evening to hang out with us and listen to some poems. I'm going to read a few poems from my new book, Prometeo. And I'm going to follow Angela's lead, and I will read a newish poem written in the past few months, since I don't think I've read a new poem in a long time. I'm going to start with At Lake Merced. Some men go down to the river. I went down instead to the lake, the air silent and stretched tightly over it, the water unmoved and dangerously still. Some men move past such a scene without even the slightest notice of it. But this morning, a man in a shell rode across this lake's smooth surface, the tip of his shell leaving a widening V behind it, the shell cleanly slicing through the water like an arrow, the way an arrow slices through air or flesh. And just like that, the image of the saint pierced through by arrows becomes fixed within my head, the arrows all leaving V's behind them, V for violence, as if the very air were an impasto on canvas. And just like that, the arrows slicing through the air become bullets, each one leaving its V behind it, the paint at the target dabbed a color as red as crimson. You may wonder why on earth a man shot through centuries ago would appear to me upon seeing this tiny shell of a boat crossing a lake, but the present day does a remarkable job of emulating the past. Let us leave it at that. Some men find nothing, and others find omens everywhere. The silence, the stillness of the air above the lake, the shells slicing through the water, the saint shot through with arrows, yet living, breathing, his chest heaving, his head slumping while the arms remain perfectly still. And the brown boy shot through with bullets, his wounds a red duller than crimson. Things like this still happen almost every day. I'm not as brave as Angela, so I don't have self-portraits in this book, but I have a lot of portraits. The way I get away with it is to convince myself that I'm painting myself, but not admitting that I'm painting myself. I have to do a lot of things to convince myself to write a poem. This poem is titled Portrait in Salt and Dusky Carmine. As in childhood, the gentility of verandas and gardens, of tea and its trappings, made me anxious. But it took very little time for someone to disappear from that world. The cane fields that separate civility from the rough shoreline allow anyone, upper crust or field hand, to disappear. Down one of many dirt rows, the line cut as straight as the cane planted on either side. One rushes from the cultured world to an untouched one. Out of the cane fields, out from their wind-rippled leaves shepherding you onward, one finds the sand and sea awaiting as if discarded by a retired god. The setting sun's red and orange fingers tried unsuccessfully to reconfigure the seven shades the water's varying depths reflected, but all that changed was the sea foam, once white, now pink. The English painter who visited here once wrote that the daily gaudiness of this sight made one long for the nuance of dimming light at dusk as it smudged its charcoal over a Hampshire field. All I can say is it takes a certain temperament to prefer a sunset in Hampshire to a sunset in the Caribbean. I do not have such a temperament. I prefer a scene that requires oil instead of charcoal. The shore empty, the sun no longer visible, the water's colors finally succumbed and darkened to night, the same as that settling over us from above. Not the sunset, but the time following sunset, the day's technicolor displays erased. Alone on the soft sand, the surf mumbled the old language. Like my great-great-grandmother who visits me in dreams, it said, salt or no salt, trust no one. It is difficult for one like me to disregard the sea and the cane fields. I am perfectly aware this place is no longer my home, but the sea says, truth is truth, and the cane field says, like the machete, you belong to me. I don't know why I'm going to share this with you all, but my first word recorded by my parents is the word obviously. I just saw Sarah have a fallout. I think she just had a stroke. I didn't speak until I was almost 5 years old, but I was reading and my father basically said, oh, he doesn't know what he's reading. He's just turning the pages over and over. And so he took the book from me, changed the page and handed it back to me. And I went back to the page and started reading. And he said, do you even understand that? And I said, obviously. That was my first word. I only bring this up before I read this poem because my parents joke that I've never shut up since, and all I do is collect words. This poem is actually in memory of my uncle, my father's brother. The Call, in memoriam Cecil Young. I am addicted to words, constantly ferret them away in anticipation. You cannot accuse me of not being prepared. I am ready for anything. I can create an image faster than just about anyone. And so the crows blurring the tree line, the sky's light dimming and shifting the Pacific, cold and impatient as ever, this is just the way I feel. Nothing more. I could gussy up those crows, transform them into something more formal, more Latinate, could use the exact genus, Corvus, but I won't. Not today. Like any addict, I too have limits. And I have written too many elegies already. The living have become jealous of the amount I have written for the dead. So leave the crows perched along the tree line watching over us. Leave them be. The setting sun, leave it be. For God's sake, what could be easier in a poem about death than a setting sun? Leave it be. Words cannot always help you, the old poet taught me, cannot always be there for you, no matter how you store them away with sharpened forethought. Not the courier in his leather sandals, his legs dark and dirty from the long race across the desert, not the carrier pigeon arriving with the news of another dead Caesar and the request you present yourself. Nothing like that. The telephone rings. Early one morning, the telephone rings, and the voice is your mother's voice. No fanfare. Your father's brother is dead. He died that morning, and your tongue went silent. Like any other minor poet, you could not find the best words, the appropriate words. Leave it be. You let your mother talk and talk to fill the silence. Leave it be. All of your practiced precision, all of the words saved up for a poem can do nothing to remedy that now. Obviously. I'm going to read the new poem. Why not? I'm going to look odd reading this because I'm going to read it off my computer screen and I won't be able to see you. This is my pandemic poem, I guess. It arose out of my walking around because I had nothing else to do on weekends or whenever I wasn't at the hospital. And it basically recounts finding something that I didn't know existed right in essentially my backyard. It's titled The Shadow Cast, and it has a little notation, Golden Gate Park, which is here in San Francisco. As any poet will tell you, the weight of the line is essential. But here, these practitioners have more on their minds than poems. The weight of their lines is uniformly light. The line selected to land and then rest gently on the surface, its goal to capture the attention of surface feeders found in nearby lakes. Back and forth, the arm swings repetitively, predictably, the line then cast out and over the pond until it comes to rest. In the late morning sunlight, the great trees littering the pools with shadow, these students of sorcery practice unspooling their lines, their craft. We have come not to study magic, but to escape the boredoms of another Saturday morning. Slowly, we take a lap around the pools. Back and forth, the casters execute the motion. They do it as a way to memorize the feel of it, their movements simple and clear. But just as we have grown accustomed to this sight, the arm swinging the line out in a swift but strident way, we spy a man suddenly whipping his arms side to side, and then in circles, wider and wider the circles, the motion violently quick and as fluid as a gymnast pulling ribbons. When he completes the chaos and snaps his arm, the line catapults. It turns out distance and gravity can be overcome. The circular motion of the shadow caster rapidly building energy and torque so that when he snaps the final motion, the line accelerates out, and much farther than the simpler motion allows. We circle and gawk. The simple motion taken by surprise. We cannot help but show our surprise. What we have witnessed is a proof of physics, but it feels as if we have been privy to something unbelievable, a manipulation, a moment, a tiny bit of powerful magic. And because Angela is my guide, I will return to the book to read this last poem. I guess I didn't realize that my book is filled with visitations, but it is. Between the dragon and the phoenix. Fire in the heart, fire in the sky. The sun just a smallish smudge resting on the horizon, out beyond the reef that breaks the waves. Fiery sun that waits for no one. I was little more than a child when my father explained that the mongrel is stronger than the thoroughbred, that I was splendidly blended, genetically engineered for survival. I somehow forgot this, misplaced this, time eroding my memory as it erodes everything. But go ask someone else to write a poem about time. Out over the bay, the sun is rising and I am running out of time. Each and every year on my birthday, I wake to watch the sunrise. I am superstitious. And today, as in years past, it is not my father, but my father's father who comes to shout at me. Whether you like it or not, you are a child of fire. You descend from the dragon, descend from the phoenix. Your blood is older than England, older than Castile. Year after year, he says the same thing. This old man, dead long before I was born. So I wake each year on the day of my birth to watch the fire enter the sky while being chastised by my dead grandfather. Despite being a creature of fire, I stay near the water. Why even try to avoid what can extinguish me? There are times I can feel the fire flickering inside my frame. The gulls are quarreling, the palm trees shimmering, the world keeps spinning on its axis. Some say I have 9 lives. Others think me a machine. Neither is true. The truth is rarely so conventional. Fire in my heart, fire in my veins. I write this down for you and watch as it goes up in flames. There are no paragraphs wide enough to contain this fire, no stanzas durable enough to house it. Blood of the dragon, blood of the phoenix. I turn my head slowly toward the east. I bow and call for another year. I stand there and demand one more year. Thank you.
Thank you, Cedale. I wanted to take a moment to invite everyone who would like to unmute and give a round of applause to our 2 readers.
Beautiful read.
Thank you.
Beautiful reading, yes.
Excellent.
Yeah, so now we're in the discussion chat phase, and I'm happy to, I don't know if Angela, you had questions for Cedal, or if Cedal, you had questions for Angela, but we can start with that, or yeah.
I'll be happy to start. I have so
Okay.
many questions.
Oh, and I'm also
Really?
I'm also happy to moderate from the chat any questions that might come up. You can drop them in the chat. I have it on speaker mode right now, so I don't really have the gallery open, but you can also just unmute and interrupt and ask a question if you'd like. But I'm also able to moderate it from the chat too. But Angela, yes, you can go right ahead, dive right in.
All right. No, I just wanted to, first of all, thank you, Cedal, for that beautiful reading and your very generous sharing of this book to all of us. I've heard you say in interviews that it's your most personal book to date. And I think for me, it's my favorite book of yours to date. I just love every single poem in this book. And even though you've made a journey from the less personal to the more personal, it feels like you're still doing what you're still so good at, which I learned from you, which is your images are so precise and so vivid, and yet each of them has a specific purpose in each of the poems. Either they're tied to history or to mythology, or they become a metaphor for something in your life. And in this book, they're used to elegize friends or family or lovers, or to celebrate lovers and relationships. And I'm just wondering how you learned to do that. I remember, I mean, I
I
know
learned how to do it by torturing all of my students.
I have proof. I have all your letters here in this fat binder. I've been looking through it. And I remember how you told me you're like me. You worshipped at the temple of the holy image, but I've learned to fight against it. And I was too timid to ask you then how you managed to. But I just want to know, how does one learn to use rhetoric so beautifully as you do? And where did you learn that?
I learned it partly from one of my own teachers, the poet Donald Justice. And I also learned it by paying more attention to it while reading. Once it was made apparent to me that, I think the expression was, have you ever seen an image you didn't fall in love with, was what I think he said to me. And years later, Ellen Voigt said, not a question, she said it as a direct statement. Well, no, she said, well, I suppose there isn't an image you don't love. So, the thing is, once you know your proclivities as a writer, you can either go one of two ways. You can either embrace it so outrageously that it becomes like this defining feature of you. Or you can say, okay, I know I have a proclivity to do this. What can I do so I'm not a one-trick pony?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, having learned a little bit about rhetoric from Don Justice, I started to see it in other poets, or maybe I was looking for it. I don't know. It's hard to say. It's a long time now.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember being struck by the fact that poets as different as Wallace Stevens or, Marilyn Chin, I mean, these are people that are very different. Both rely on rhetorical moves and structures. John Ashbery, Bridget Kelly. I mean, it struck me that rhetoric was a way of engaging the reader. It wasn't about style.
Mm-hmm.
And I just started taking copious notes about it. And I think, I don't think I'm exaggerating. I think most of my students over the years have been aware of the fact that I'm interested in rhetoric, because I often challenge them to think more about rhetoric and to think about how a reader experiences the poem. But to go back briefly to what you said at the beginning, Angela, I do think it's my most personal book. And I don't think I could have written it as my first book. I don't think I had the tools. A lot of the things in this book about my family and history and where I fall in my family's history, it's not new. I've lived with it my whole life. And I think if I had tried to write about it, say 3 or 4 books back, they wouldn't have the direct force they have now. I think they would be more fussy and would be me playing with description. Like, I don't know, I could spend paragraphs, stanzas and stanzas writing about a beach. And I'd probably think, this is great. Until someone said, you realize that all you have is a stream of like images and there's no poem here? But yeah, I think sometimes you have to be ready. You have to be ready for the material.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm amazed at your book and the fact that, you know, you manage what has to be an overwhelming sense of grief with the same elegance that you've handled material since you were a student. I mean, I'm amazed by that.
You. Well, thank you. I can't take all the credit. I mean, you were, after all, my teacher, but it's interesting to me. What struck me is that my first impulse as a poet, when I started writing, even my first book, was to write about my family and to just spill it all out there, my stories, my emotions, and also my tendency to hold on to the image and to catalog them, which you repeatedly told me you don't want to just catalog your images. You want to make sure you prioritize them like Bishop, or revise them, or use them in a way that makes an argument. And that was the first I'd heard of that. And your idea to deliberately look for ways that poets use rhetoric and to study that was something that never occurred to me. I think many of us here in this room were told, show, don't tell. And we kept that, you know, as the core of writing is show, not tell. And that's what we did. We just kept showing and not telling. And here's this teacher telling me, no, you have to tell. You have to hold sway in the poem. And the reader has to leave with something worth keeping, not just, you know, beautiful images are beautiful. They seduce us, but they vanish after a while. And then what's the reader left with? And that's a lesson I'm still trying to remember, that an image has to have a purpose in a poem. And you do it so beautifully in each of your books, but especially in this book that marries both your family history and these beautiful images and rhetoric. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for that generous response. I want other people to get a chance to ask questions too, so.
Questions, anyone? Come on, I see some fellow Wallies in the room. I have a question for both of you. But I wanted to lead with this directly for Cedale. I know that you started off as a painter, actually, and that in this book, there's several references to different paintings, and you know, the recurring like portrait of is like one of the through threads in the collection. And I was wondering if you could both speak to the influence on other artistic disciplines in your work, and how the poet is, or I'm kind of guessing that it's nice to think about as a poet to borrow from other artistic practices. And I'm wondering if either of you are interested in talking about that.
You know, it's a tough question. Of course you would ask a tough question. But I only know visual art and writing. I don't really have experience with any other arts. I know people that like write music. I know people that, you know, do other things, but I personally don't have I can't draw on that because that's not my background. I I actually I actually was not aware until probably my third book how much I used things related to painting until someone pointed it out to me. And I suspect it's one of those things that if whatever you do in your life, it's going to end up in your poems. Whether you want to or not, it ends up there. And I guess for me, I started out as a painter and I love painting and I always joke that I'm going to go back to it, but I haven't. And so it ends up in my work. I actually didn't realize until after this book was actually published the fact that there's so many things about painting in it. I just didn't realize. It was after the book came out and I was like, oh, I have a poem about a painting by Jasper Johns. And oh, I also have a poem about Rembrandt. And I was like, oh my God, this is horrifying. um, but I think it's just, it's the things that draw you. They end up in your work. I would imagine if a poet started out as a chef, that all kinds of fantastic allusions to food and preparation of food would show up in poems. Why don't we have any chef poets? I want to read those poems. That's what I want.
Well, for me, I guess I'm not a visual artist. I mean, I couldn't even draw to save my life, but I grew up in a family of musicians. My father played violin, as you know, and my mother played the piano. And I feel that musicality is what most of us aspire to in poetry. I know I do, and maybe that's because I grew up around a lot of music, whether recorded or being played live by my parents, which they did regularly in the evenings. But also, I was raised in the Catholic Church. I'm not as devout as my parents were, I'll admit, but I feel like the Psalms and the music and the liturgy, the music of the Catholic Church is very repetitive and incantatory, and it really those were really the first poems I ever heard, the Psalms, and I think those devices show up in my poems in the way I use repetition and in those in those poems that alternate from borrowed lines and original lines. I feel that that's sort of a call and response. And I also am drawn to repetitive forms like the pantoum. I've been playing with the pantoum a lot lately. And I trace it back to that, to the weekly ritual of Mass and the Rosary, which my parents made us all recite with them every night. So yeah, you just draw from whatever you have. That's where language comes from, right? It's what you're exposed to. But I mean, that leads me to my next question to Cedale. I feel that we share so much in common. I mean, I lived in South Florida for a while. I know you were raised there. We both went to Jesuit schools for undergrad. You went to Boston College, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I went to Ateneo de Manila in the Philippines, which is a Jesuit school. And so there's a lot of allusions to Catholicism in your work. You mentioned the saints. You mentioned, I mean, it's full of allusions, and I wonder how that's informed your writing. Is it because you went to the Jesuit school, or is it also part of your upbringing? And the second part of that is, we all know that Jesuit education seeks to develop the whole person. And so even if you're a science major, you have to take philosophy and history and literature, most of all. That's where I started loving poetry, where I've met Eliot and Hopkins and Millay. And I'm wondering if that was in your case, if that was also where you first developed your love of poetry, or if it went beyond or came before that.
Well, the interesting thing is I've always loved reading, and I've always liked classics and poetry and things like that. It just never occurred to me that that would be something that one did. It just never occurred to me. I never met anyone that wrote poems or anything like that. So it seemed completely alien to me. And I didn't actually start into loving and writing poems regularly because of a class. I was an art editor for the literary magazine on campus at Boston College. And very few people submitted art. I mean, mostly I went and begged other people in the painting program for work, either for the cover or for the interior pages. But every week, the editorial board would meet and talk about poems because that's what came in. It's like everything in the world. Most of everything that comes in is poetry. And I kept thinking, I don't know. I mean, I guess I was full of myself. I would be like, oh, this poem is crap. Oh, this poem is terrible. And I had no problem saying this. I wasn't even studying poetry. I was an art editor, and I'd be like, this poem is cliched. I'm sure this is shocking to anyone who knows me. But the thing is, all of my fellow editors were going to take a poetry workshop, and I decided that I wanted to take the workshop. And I basically went and begged the teacher every day for a week to let me take this class. And she introduced me at a reading at Boston College, and she told the story. I think some people think I made this up, but she told them that this guy showed up at her office every day and he was like, can I take your class? Can I take your class? Can I take your class? And she finally just gave in and let me take the class. I've never stopped writing since then. But I do think that my Jesuit education, even though at the time I would have bristled if anyone had mentioned this, I do think it made me a different kind of thinker. And I think part of it is that it didn't matter, as you pointed out, it didn't matter what you majored in. You had to take philosophy, you had to take science, you had to take art, you had to take mathematics. It was like an endless core of things you had to take. But it also gave you a kind of way of talking across disciplines, because things came up all the time in classes that you had learned about in other classes. And suddenly it didn't seem like all these subjects were so separate. So I can remember sitting in philosophy and talking about Kant and realizing that this was out of the same period as what I had just learned in European history. And I was floored by that. I think today, I mean, I don't know if Jesuit schools still are that way today, but I think most colleges today are not that interested in the core. I think the focus now about college is getting skills to go into the workplace. I actually think that's like the worst thing ever. It's like, yeah, you can learn skills whenever you want. Like, when are you going to have a chance to sit down and think about Kant or Heidegger or who knows what? So I wouldn't trade it for the world now, even though when I was a student, I doubt I would have said that. I probably would have said, can I get out of school now?
Yeah, well, I agree. I feel like the humanities are valuable precisely because they're not useful in the practical world, but we need them. We need them for the soul, for building the soul. And it's the same with poetry. We need.
I also think that it's very hard to learn empathy if you never read literature.
Absolutely.
And if I read one more time about how blah de blah was a troubled soul, and that's why he bought guns and shot up the store and killed 18 people, and then someone will say he had no empathy, and then you look at his background and he studied I don't know what. I actually feel like part of the reason we don't have a shared humanity anymore is that we don't study the humanities. We don't read. We take everything in from a computer screen, and the computers are great, but reading a novel forces you to inhabit the novel. Reading a poem forces you to inhabit the mindscape of someone else. If I read a poem by Nathan, I'm always like, oh my God, get me out of this poem as quickly as I can. Nathan's scary. But I also love it because Nathan doesn't think like I do. So I don't know. I do think the humanities are important. And I feel like it can't all be about STEM. It can't all be about science and engineering and mathematics. And we need people to learn those things, but we also need to learn how to be human.
Well said.
And I'll be running for office come this fall.
I think there's a question from Nathan in the chat.
What is Nathan's question?
I gave you an easy one, Cedale. I want you both an easy one. Yes, and Nathan, class of Cedale, 2011. And I would just wanted to know, since we have the former sort of like advisor student relationship here, if you both could talk about the sort of the best lessons that you both learned from one another as you worked together.
Ooh.
That's easy for me.
Well, you go first then. Not so easy for me.
It is very easy for me. I told Angela this, I believe. I have to think about this. Let me go back a little bit in time. So between her first and second packet, Angela had a run-in with medicine where there was a question about whether or not something was wrong. And she had to actually go and do tests at the hospital, etc. And she emailed me and said, would it be possible for her to turn a few things in late? And I said, well, why is that? And she explained, and I said, sure, please do that. She didn't turn anything in late. She actually turned everything in slightly early, and some of it was actually from the hospital. And I remember I wrote in my letter to her in her final packet that I know you will be successful because you have been one of the most diligent students I have ever had. And even when faced with adversity, you still found a way to do the work. And I was right. I'm always right, Nathan.
Okay, you're making me cry now. I wasn't planning on it, but well, I guess to dovetail what you just said, the most important thing I learned from Cedale after hearing that story, I've changed the most important thing, and it's this. When I had that scary test, it was a mammogram, and everything was fine. But when I didn't know, and it was just really scary, I remember Cedale writing in his letter, you don't need to submit anything, just keep reading poetry. Poetry is a balm, and it will save you. And that's how I was able to finish the packet. Just the permission to read, to just read, just inspired me to keep working and getting the work done.
Now you're going to make me cry. And I never cry.
Okay. But the second most important thing I learned was not to worship at the temple of image. In fact, here's a packet where I did that, and you can see all the red lines. This is how I would read my letters from Cedale. I would blur my eyes to see how much blue, because blue was the good stuff, and how much red. This was clearly all red because there was too much imagery in the rhetoric. Too narrative. Everything was this happened and this happened and this happened. But then he just blasted my mind open by rewriting the poem using repetition, eliding through time, going future, past, just kind of breaking up the poem and putting it back together in the most unexpected way. And I thought, wow, you can do that. You can do that in poetry. Nobody ever told me. That was life-changing.
Leave it to Nathan to make us both cry.
I know, right, Nathan?
My job is done. My job is now done.
Wow, I don't know. I think we need to, I don't know if we can proceed.
I don't know if I can proceed. I'm gonna get myself a stiff drink, I think.
For those of you who never had the pleasure and the anguish, pain of learning from Cedale, the wielder of the red pen, but also you always knew the blue was like good. It was normally like red, blue, black was like meh, like. So when you got the blue, it was like it meant a lot, and I really appreciated that because I felt like I wasn't being bullshitted, and I also felt like the weight of the blue meant more. And it wasn't, and it also was a great way to learn about, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling, but yeah, anyone who received a packet back from CDL knows what I'm talking about. And Nathan, what are you saying?
Like, and you always scrolled straight to the poems. Like you just went, you bypassed the letter altogether just to see what color your poems were. And then you read the letter.
I don't know about that. I was always delaying the poems because I was so afraid of those red marks. And the letters were so juicy too. There was just so much in there. So many like reading recommendations, and you talk about Bishop and how Bishop was really sneaky and had images, but the images were really being used as arguments or windows into the human condition. So much. There's so much in there in those letters. That's why I keep them in this binder. And I was telling CDL, this is just a half of them. That's half of our correspondence. There's another binder somewhere.
The mystery binder.
Are there any last questions for our poets tonight? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I was just, as a person who has not been lucky enough to study with either of you, I was really interested by this idea of what rhetoric is in poetry, and what it means to maybe transform the image or put it in its place in a way. And I just wondered if either of you or both of you had any thoughts for where I could go to get deeper into that.
Well, I'll answer the first part of the question at the risk of being criticized by my teacher. I hope I get it right. What I learned from CDALE is that you could, instead of just cataloging images, you could also sometimes pause and ask a question. So turn to the interrogative mode, or you can make an assertion or an utterance that shows that you're in charge of these images, that you're holding sway, and you're uncovering a little bit what those images are trying to speak to, whether it's the emotional life of the speaker, or whether it's an argument or a grand thought that underlies those images. So that's my short answer. CDALE?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And the other thing is, when you think about rhetoric and poetry, it's a very specific relationship that the rhetoric is being used for. It's between the speaker of the poem and the reader of the poem. And, I say this a lot, but no matter how people believe that they, the writer, are the speaker of their poem, it's never true. It's always a facet of you. It's how much of you actually want to portray at that moment.
Right.
So if you yourself can't be there in the poem, and you want your speaker to be convincing to a reader, then the speaker has to engage the reader. And image is a rhetorical device in poetry, but it's a kind of lulling, pleasing, I don't want to say simple device is pejorative, but almost anyone reading a poem can appreciate an image. But if all you have are images, I think Angela said this, and I know I've said it, you walk away from the poem and within hours you can't remember much about the poem. Images just go. Whereas if you're reading something by like Sylvia Plath and she's talking about a blackberry field, and then all of a sudden she's like commands you to do something with an imperative, that kind of like sticks in your head and you kind of can't get the poem out of you. You know this. You've read poems where you can't get them out of you, like even years later. I think even in my dying breath, I will be thinking of the end of Bridget Kelly's poem Song, you know, the heart dies of such sweetness. They're just poems that will stick in you, and it's usually based on rhetoric. It's not a highfalutin thing. I mean, it is based in part on Aristotle's Poetics, but it's about you as the writer trying to make your speaker of your poem engage with the reader, who you don't know. So it's kind of a challenge. Eventually, there will be a book called The Art of Rhetoric in Poetry. I just have a feeling about that.
You have to.
Are you going to write it for us, Cito?
No, but I'm going to force someone else to. I could write it.
You could very well write it. You must write it, Cedale.
Lord help me.
Well, it makes me think of that poem, the James Wright poem, where it's image, 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 and then he ends with "I have wasted my life," and that's
exactly.
Everything. It's everything, right? And it's just 5 words.
We got a head nod from Matthew. I think that means it's time to go.
Thank you so much, Cito. Thank you, Angela. It was the highlight of my week to be able to host you tonight. And thank you so much for everyone who joined us this evening, near and far. I know that the Zoom room feels like we've been on a lot of Zoom, but this one felt especially special. And thank you so much. If you haven't bought the books, I'm just gonna drop a link into the chat for 4-Way Books. Please go out and order these poets' books. And yeah, have a great weekend. Stay well, stay safe. I hope you all get the vaccination and that we can all be together soon.
Sarah,
thank you so much.
Thank you, Cedale. Such a pleasure to talk to you.
A pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody, for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing, Sarah. Thank you, Cedale and Angela. It was such a great reading.
Great seeing you, Nathan. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for coming.